Probably the number one question concerning God and His work in our lives is, why do bad things happen to good people? It's a question which deeply disturbs 21st century man. Robert L. Short, in his commentary, A Time to be Born, A Time to Die, writes, more than ever before, modern man has been driven back on himself to answer the same stark question Ecclesiastes was forced to face with such brutal honesty. It's a question which keeps non-believers from believing. And, worse yet, it's a question which spurs real doubt into the lives and minds of otherwise contented believers. Sadly, it's just too easy to see the inequities of this world. Unfairness surrounds us. We see the abuse of authority. The police use excessive force. The poor become nothing more than the proverbial tennis ball in the eyes of politicians. The difference between the haves and the have-nots becomes more marked every single year. We see Christian families torn apart by divorce. We could understand if there was infidelity. We could understand if they were just wicked or evil people. We could understand if they were impolite or not nice. But they're Christians. And so their homes are torn apart. We see accidents and injuries which require out-of-pocket expense from the injured, which depletes their savings and puts them further behind the eight ball. Even Christian men and women may become bankrupt, be foreclosed upon, or have creditors pursuing them. Good organizations, sometimes Christian ones, close their doors because they simply cannot compete with the lesser entities. We see millions of innocents put out of work by a virus which is not their making. We see natural catastrophes which take lives, sometimes even of the faithful. We see court systems which seem to rely more on the quality of the attorneys involved than they rely upon the equity and fairness of the law. So why do bad things happen to good people? Sometimes the question is rephrased to ask, if God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving, why does He allow such things to happen? And the problem with that rephrasing is that it places the blame onto the invisible shoulders of God, thereby denying His love, His omniscience, and His omnipotence. And while the question is one for which man demands an answer, man tends to overlook the fact that it is instead a question at which man is at the very center. It's a question more about us than it is about our God. We feel the inequity and we demand answers. If we don't get them, we begin our own interpretation from which we develop our own conclusion. And sadly, too often that conclusion totally escapes notice of God. Granted, this is not an easy question, especially if you're in the midst of pain right now. If your family is breaking up, you hurt and naturally want to scream, why? Why is it happening? What did I do? If illness is threatening a family member, the most natural response is the same. Why is it happening? And maybe after that comes the blame of the medical profession for not developing a cure or for being too concerned with dollars and cents and not concerned enough about just the welfare of humanity. If your stock portfolio has dried up, you want to know the reason. After all, your rich stockbroker promised you you were set for life. If your children are wayward, you look for a cause outside the home because, after all, it cannot be your fault. You're a good person. If the church is in financial ruin or simply shrinking in size, it must be the preacher's fault. After all, only good people attend here. Unfortunately, there are no easy one-liner answers to this question any more than there are simple one-line answers to any of life's tough questions. Not only does this question disturb 21st century man, 30 centuries ago, it was a question which also resonated with Solomon in all of his glory. And unfortunately, no single man, not even the great Solomon, has ever had a full answer to this question. In his commentary, Short later adds, disillusionment and world weariness are indeed the stuff modern men and Ecclesiastes are both made of. Older certainties have crumbled, and we look, some despairingly, for value and meaning. His question is ours, yes. But in addition, his method for finding an answer to his question is also surprisingly up to date, as are likewise many of his conclusions. And Short goes on to explain that much of our disillusionment simply comes from the fact that we are now monotheists. We have eliminated the worship of idols, whether they be gold, silver, comfort, or success. And so, as Solomon has pointed out, under the sun there is simply no material left from which to make an answer. And like the other questions in this series, to find the answer we must put on our thinking caps. This is not a question which will be answered in an instant. It is not a question for which we can Google an answer on the internet. We will never locate a blog capable of giving us the answer in full. And sadly, it is a question, like all tough questions, which may come back to haunt us again and again throughout our lives on this earth, as we again and again face the iniquities of this life. Ecclesiastes chapter 8. Verse 14, there is futility which is done on the earth. That is, there are righteous men to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked. This morning, we, along with Solomon, take a look at the toughest of the tough questions. Man can get through this life even if he never develops a purpose. Man can live for 70, 80 years without ever laying hold of a dream for his life. And time may pass so quickly that man can get through life without ever having the opportunity to ask, where has all the time gone? But nearly every man has had to ask at least one time in his life, why do bad things happen to good people? Or at the least its counterpart, why do good things happen to bad people? Solomon walks us through his observations first by noting, bad things happen even to good citizens. Most of us have probably heard the old adage, the only things sure in this life are death and taxes. But on the other hand, most of us were probably also led to believe the flip side of the coin. If you pay your taxes, if you take care of your health, if you are respectful, if you honor those who have authority, if you do what you're told, your life will be good. And as a king, Solomon would have liked to offer the same kind of hope to his people. And accordingly, he offers to his readers direction on how to mark their lives as those of good citizens. Chapter 8, verse 2. I say, keep the command of the king because of the oath before God. Do not be in a hurry to leave him. Do not join in an evil matter, for he will do whatever he pleases. Since the word of the king is authoritative, who will say to him, what are you doing? He who keeps a royal command experiences no trouble, for a wise heart knows the proper time and procedure. Solomon gives us 4 characteristics which mark good citizens even 30 centuries later. Good citizens honor God. You know, one of the sharpest criticisms against our current president is his nationalistic pride. He sees America as a special place and wants it to remain as one. But in the global market, there are those who view such a nationalistic attitude as inappropriate. But Solomon's words give us real meaning for nationalism. There's a real demand for our loyalties. The honoring of one's governors, the whole of the government, and by extension, the land itself, is entirely within God's will and his purpose. Man. The government, in Solomon's case, a king, has responsibilities thrust upon it in the pleasure and purpose of God. And it's only as we oppose that order that we step aside from God's plan. Paul wrote much the same idea. Let every person be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And those which exist are established by God. Therefore, he who resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise for the same. But it's important that we note something here. Paul's words do not refer to an Israelite king or even to a godly king or even to particularly a righteous, virtuous king. Paul's words appear in his epistle to the Romans, and so his words are in reference to the Roman emperor, his empire, and even Rome's deification of their empire or emperor. And yet, in such extremes, Paul makes it clear Solomon's wise standards hold true. Authority is given of God. Rulers generally honor good citizens. Condemnation is sure and swift for lawbreakers. And Peter writes similar words of instruction. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. To be good citizens, we mark our life as those honoring God, by honoring those who God has placed in charge. If a good citizen is to honor God, then he will also possess the second characteristic. Good citizens are patient. And perhaps this is easier to see in the case of a kingdom with a king who rules for life than it is for a democratic republic who elects a president every 4 years. However, the parallel can still be made. A good citizen is not a citizen who tries to undermine his officials. A good citizen works with his officials. As we saw a moment ago, Peter demands our submission to the king or to any representative of the established government. Thanks to Shakespeare's depiction of the events, we all remember Julius Caesar's assassination on the Senate steps, surrounded by political enemies and even friends. And while such deeds are not uncommon around the world, a good citizen is not one who readily sticks a knife in the back of a leader who is down. Good citizens recognize the leader's right of choice, so that even though no human leader is perfect, a good citizen lends the benefit of the doubt. And it's that benefit of the doubt which yields the third characteristic of a good citizen. Good citizens do not second guess their leaders. You know, no man, not even a ruling monarch, has ever had unanimous public opinion. Solomon was no different. While the people loved the king, the people felt the weight of his power. Listen to the words of all Israel spoken to Rehoboam, his son, when Solomon passed. Your father made our yoke hard. Therefore, lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke which he put on us, and we will serve you. Ease up a little bit, man. We can't take this. We are going to revolt. The sad truth is, the people tolerated Solomon only because his wisdom was praised not only in Israel but throughout the world. He was truly the love child of their beloved King David. His achievements were visible. He had extended Israel beyond his father's borders. He built the temple of which his father had only dreamed. Jerusalem had never been more prosperous, and he probably had a certain charisma about him, which naturally drew the people to him. But in reality, like all governments, he had not done any real favors for the people. His grand scale of living, while princely, also demanded a kingly price. The people felt oppressed even as he lived in splendor. And while silver may have been worthless to Solomon, it was still the common man's coin. And what can be said of a ruling monarch, even as great as Solomon, is more apparent in that of an elected official. It seems that almost immediately after an election, there is talk of unseating that candidate in the next election. However, the citizen who plays armchair quarterback without ever assuming the leadership position does not know the ramifications of the office and has no right to second guess the leadership God has placed over them. And that's true in the corporate world, where an executive must make sweeping decisions for the good of the firm, but which may at the same time hurt individuals. It's true in a nation where the welfare of the many must outweigh the concerns of the few. And it's true in the church, where decisions must be made in a somewhat less than democratic fashion. None of that means that the common man has absolutely no say, which brings us to the fourth characteristic of a good citizen. Good citizens must voice their concerns. And probably one of the most significant lines of our Declaration of Independence is, when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism. It is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future. There are times when people must express their complaint. There are times when people must offer their suggestions. There are times when people might give their advice. And hopefully even a king will be willing to hear and consider the complaints, the suggestions, and the advice of those concerned. However, as Solomon points out, the wise heart knows the proper time and procedure. And our forefathers knew the same, for the Declaration also records, prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. You don't throw the government under the bus for the first minor complaint, the first indiscretion, the first foul. And neither Solomon nor the New Testament apostles are excluding the occasional need to confront or even replace a government. However, all make it clear that it is not a matter to be taken lightly, because government is authoritative for a reason. Unfortunately, even being a good citizen is no guarantee to a good life. Bad things may still be a very real and grievous part of the lives of even the good citizen. Verse 14, there is futility which is done on the earth. That is, there are righteous men to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked. Why do good things happen? Or why do bad things happen to good people? Solomon makes an even more stark observation. Bad things simply happen. Verse 7. If no one knows what will happen, who can tell him when it will happen? No man has authority to restrain the wind with the wind, or authority over the day of death. And there is no discharge to the time of war, and evil will not deliver those who practice it. Unfortunately, in this broken world filled with broken men, bad things simply happen, and no man can prevent the calamities constantly assailing his life. Sadly, no man can even predict when they will assail. And if we do not know what's coming, we cannot tell when it might be coming. And that's why even the best of our efforts must be understood as, at the least, only somewhat effective. Pensions are no surety against a declining market. Health insurance does not prevent disease or injury. It only lessens the cost of treatment. A paid mortgage does not alleviate the need for a new roof. A title to a car does not prevent accidents or breakdowns. But worse yet, Solomon gives us 4 specific times in which we will simply be caught unaware. First, bad things happen through nature. I think I've told you before about Monday, May 7th, 1984. I got home after working all night at the state hospital. It was about 7:30. I went to bed. 4.5 hours later at noon, I was awakened by sirens that you could hear from miles. And I had no idea what was going on. I looked out the windows of the apartment. I couldn't see what was going on. I had no comprehension at all. So I called the church to ask the senior minister what was happening. He said, "Why? What's bothering me?" I said, "I hear these sirens. They're just..." And he started laughing. He said, "Those are the tornado sirens. They go off the first Monday of every month at noon just to test them." Now, I don't know how long Wichita Falls had the sirens in place, but I do know that just a year or two before I arrived in Texas, 51% of the city had been torn apart by tornadoes. After a few months, when I could readily sleep through the predictable sirens, I wondered just how effective they really were. Because man doesn't worry about nature. He takes it for granted. He accepts that it is what it is. And so it naturally catches him unaware. And aside from tornadoes, we are also familiar with hurricanes, flash floods, wildfires, earthquakes, and any other assault. from the force of nature. And unfortunately, even the best of laws will not prevent such catastrophes. No man has ever found a way to harness the wind. But nature is not our only foe. Bad things happen with the approach of death. We all known people who lived to a ripe old age. You all remember not too many years ago, Corinth held that double birthday party for our 2 centenarians. But we have also known people who were taken unexpectedly. One of the senior cheerleaders from my high school class passed just 3 months before graduation. One of the most popular girls in my freshman year of college was killed in a car accident between our freshman and sophomore years. Celebrities who seem to have finally made it pass in the prime of their careers. And even ministers may face the uncertainty of death's unannounced approach. And Solomon reminds us that our days are not ours to choose. All men face death on its terms and in its time. But sadly, there are other resolute forces which also work against us. War is the ultimate of bad things. No man can escape war. It comes to all people of all nations for any variety of reasons. But when war comes, no man is left unaffected. 2 months after I assumed my role as associate minister in Pennsylvania, Operation Desert Storm was initiated. And while I was not personally affected, one of the ladies in the church came to my office one day. She was worried. They were calling up the National Guard for Desert Storm, and she was concerned that her daughter would soon be in the Middle East. She had taken money from the National Guard for her college education. Unfortunately, that's the risk and the reality of war. Conscription for service is a right of every government, and while we may remember from our history those who fled to Canada to escape the draft in Vietnam, those men were the exceptions, not the rule. When it comes to a nation, all men must face the reality of war. And finally, Solomon reminds us doing bad things will never save us. If living the life of good citizens will not deliver us, it must go without saying we should have even less expectation in living as social reprobates. The fact is, there are quite enough evils in the world. We dare not hope that by adding to the number, we will be better off for it. For while bad things simply happen, our Lord reminds us that we have a responsibility to take a different path. I say to you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Now, since Solomon is viewing man's activities under the sun, the good life will not necessarily save us, but such a life does have the potential to prove us to be the kind of men we were intended to be, men in the image of God. And so finally, Solomon makes one last observation. Bad things are dispelled in living day to day. Verse 15. So I commended pleasure, for there is nothing good for a man under the sun except to eat and to drink and to be merry. And this will stand by him in his toils throughout the days of his life, which God has given him under the sun. And again, we must remember that Solomon is not recommending a hedonistic approach to life. He's already declared that pleasure, just for pleasure's sake, is just as vain, just as futile, just as empty as any of the other tasks we may face. He is simply reminding us that the tough question, perhaps in this case, the toughest question of all, will never be answered. And so the only solace man may find under the sun is the simple pleasures this life affords. A full belly, good rest, and the merriment which comes in dining with friends. And such pleasures are again proven necessary, as the baddest of the bad is man's ignorance. Verse 16. When I gave my heart to know wisdom and to see the task which has been done on the earth, even though one should never sleep day or night, and I saw every work of God, I concluded that man cannot discover the work which has been done under the sun. Even though man should seek laboriously, he will not discover, and though the wise man should say, I know, he cannot discover. Sadly, even with all his wisdom, Solomon realized the answer was beyond him. Man's ignorance remains because man's generations are unchanging. Solomon again returns to that same idea of the grievous task. Man cannot hope to understand himself or his fellows in a mere 70 to 80 years, much less can he hope to discern the mysteries of the universe. The cycle begins afresh with each new generation, and accordingly, each new generation begins with the same question. And this is illustrated probably in the first season of the original Star Trek. Captain Kirk and the Enterprise come upon a ship of genetically engineered humans who had fled the Earth 2 centuries earlier. So for 2 centuries, they've been in cryogenic freeze, out in the middle of space, headed for who knows where. And once they arouse them, in an interview with Kirk, Khan, the leader of the genetically engineered, says, I am surprised at how little improvement there has been in human evolution. And that's after 2 centuries. Oh, there's been technical advancement, but how little man himself has changed. You know, when we look at Genesis and when we look at the New Testament and when we look at the stories of the Old Testament and when we consider man's history throughout the ages, we realize the same truth, just how little man has changed himself. And Solomon surely feels that same kind of wonder. Man does not progress. Man does not have the adequate time to make sense of it all. Man simply is locked in to his ignorance. And man's generations are unchanging because there are not enough hours in the day. When I give my heart to know wisdom and to see the task which has been done on the earth, even though one should never sleep day or night, Solomon goes a step beyond last week's question of where has all the time gone. Instead, he's acknowledging that there was never enough time in the first place. Even if a man gave up his sleep for the pursuit of understanding, man would be destined to fail. Even if man never took a rest, never closed his eyes, never put his mind at ease, he would not come to the conclusion. You know, one must wonder how many sleepless nights Solomon wrestled with the tough questions to which he could not find adequate answer. And such pleasures are again proven necessary as the worst of man's handicaps is his weakness. Even though a man should seek laboriously, he will not discover. And though the wise man should say, I know, he cannot discover. To answer this question is like the old adage, the hurrier I go, the behinder I get. No matter how hard we try to answer the tough questions, they remain beyond us. But there are men in every generation who believe they are on the verge of the discovery, which can make all the difference. So why do bad things happen to good people? Why do we feel the pain and the crisis of such times? Why can't we understand the reasons? 30 centuries ago, Solomon recognized the question as one that needs to be asked. And just maybe he also does present the answer after all. Verse 9. All this I've seen and applied my mind to every deed that has been done under the sun, wherein a man has exercised authority over another man to his hurt. This too is futility, because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed quickly. Therefore, the hearts of the sons of men among them are given fully to do evil. You know, the answer simply comes down to the fact that man never changes. He does not evolve. He does not better himself. He does not become more noble. He remains the same from generation to generation, and he feels the need to abuse his fellows in order to elevate himself. And because he sees no punishment forthcoming, his avarice is not diminished. His course is not checked. and he continues to drag down those around him. And as we mentioned at the beginning, man is not merely asking the question, man is at the center of the question. Man corrupted himself and all of creation by stepping aside from God's law. And man continues that corruption to this day. Because man does not see God come down and smite him for what he's doing. Perhaps Paul came to the best conclusion for us to get beyond this dilemma. Therefore, be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. Be careful how you walk, and then it won't matter why bad things happen to good people. For most of us, simple survival and the defense of the faith is more than enough to keep us busy without trying to answer the unanswerable. Someday God may give us the reasons for all the troubles which assail us, but I would not count on that blame resting on him. Man is generally at the center